Good morning. It's time for an art update. It's actually a very dark and rainy day this morning. We had some very loud thunderstorms last night, and the sound of the thunder woke me up a few times. So it's a bit of a dreary day. Anyway, over the weekend, I finished reading this book, The History of the Funnies. So before I show you some of my progress with my artwork, let me just talk about the conclusion of this book, and I'll show you a comic book that I read also. So anyway, most of this book, as I've said before in previous videos, really dwells on the golden age of the newspaper comic. So really, I'd say maybe the 1920s, maybe through the 1940s. That was that was really the time when those strips flourished. They had a great deal of space and a great deal of readership. Comics were able to dwell symbiotically with radio, but by the 1950s, newspapers were refusing to adapt to television in the same way that newspapers had adapted to radio in generations past. Newspapers used to be sort of a combination of the news, journals, artwork, and kind of like Facebook in a way. And newspapers did evolve and change for generations until the 1950s when they just assumed that they didn't have to change anymore. And so rather than change, they started taking shortcuts, and one place where they definitely took shortcuts was with cartoons. This is quite ironic when one reads the history of the comics because comics, uh, when Hearst and Pulitzer were essentially creating comics, comics were a means to sell these newspapers. They were advertisements for the newspapers, and cutting out the comics and really just getting rid of that entire purpose for them was counterproductive to selling newspapers. It did take some time for newspapers to really fall into their death knells, but even by the 1980s, newspapers were not doing well at all. So long before the internet came about, newspapers were in serious trouble. But anyway, so the last, basically from the 1950s to the 1990s would be the last 20 or 30 pages of this book. So we just really just zip through that time period because, aside from Peanuts and Pogo and, a few others, comics were just disappearing from the newspapers. Comic strips were being not only made smaller, but the editors wanted them to be simpler in style. Here's the very first Beetle Bailey. As I mentioned before, instead of competing with the narrative powers of television, the editors just assumed that the same people who are able to watch The Twilight Zone and watch decades spanning soap operas were incapable of reading text with pictures. And so the editors purposely killed. Oh, there's King of a River. That one looks really interesting. But they killed the adventure comic strip in the 60s and the 70s, and they really were only interested in gags. Really, such a sort of like the New Yorker gags in a way, if you're familiar with that genre of cartoon. Sam Strip looks interesting. It's a spoof of comic strip conventions. I believe it was done by Mort Walker, or maybe it was somehow associated with him. And honestly, these last few decades are rather tragic, in a way. Here they're trying to revive Little Orphan Annie. Now, this book was published before Calvin and Hobbes was retired in 1995. So, in some ways, this book does really show the bitter end of the newspaper comic strip. We did have a slight revival in the 1980s. We have Bloom County, The Far Side, and Calvin and Hobbes is basically the last, the final renaissance of the newspaper comic strip. but even they were not big enough to save them. And I'm going to talk about Kudzu one of these days because that's an important strip. It was a local strip, one that made good. Dilbert is still around. All right, the last couple pages are kind of a horror show or a tragedy, depending on how you look at it. Here we read about how there was an attempt to bring back Pogo around 1989, and it lasted 2 or 3 years, and it was quite sad. Actually, I would like to read this revival of Pogo if it's available anymore. Then we read about how Guy Gilchrist did a comic for the Muppet Babies for a time. Now, Guy Gilchrist later on did Nancy, and he retired from Nancy just a few months ago. So after the time of this writing. And then we have this final paragraph, which is meant to be hopeful, but is actually quite rather sad. Uh, while the number of daily newspapers continues to drop, I mean, this is 1995, comics are moving into such electronic outlets as the CD-ROM. It seems safe to assume that comic strips will celebrate many birthdays beyond their 100th. So, web strips didn't quite exist yet, but there's some anticipation that they would exist. Anyway, before I show you my artwork, let me show you this comic book. About 6 weeks ago, I went to Ashboro to visit my grandfather, and while I was there, I went to the oldest comic book store in North Carolina, the Comic Conspiracy, and I picked up some comics, and this is one of them. This is interesting because this is an example of a movie tie-in comic book. Now, in days before the VCR, movie tie-ins were very important, and these tie-ins could have been newspaper pictures, that could have been magazines, they could have been novelizations, or in this case, a comic book. This was a way not only to promote, but to relive the experience. Now, when this was made, I'm sure the creators, maybe they just had a few pictures, maybe part of a script, maybe a whole script. But what's interesting to see the differences here and the film. Now, I love the Ray Harryhausen films. They are classics. The Voyage of the Argonauts. That's a great film with the Skeleton Man. The first Sinbad movie is with the dragon. That's really great. So anyway, when this was made, I'm not sure that they had access to finished materials because the slave girl is Carolyn Monroe in the film. Doesn't quite look like her. And the bad guy was played by Tom Baker before he became the Doctor. I think the fourth Doctor. Anyway, Stanley Presents. Roy Thomas is the editor. Roy Thomas did the Conan books. Freely adapted from the screenplay by Brian Clemens. So, maybe I guess they had a complete screenplay, perhaps. So, this was a time when a whole film had to be condensed to maybe 2 comics, maybe 3. I want to say 2, 1974. So, there are narration scrolls all over the place. It looks more like Carolyn Monroe there. So this would be the Tom Baker character. But ideally, a film really should be 6 to 12 comics, and we should have a minimum of narration, maybe narration on the first and the last scene as sort of a bookend. Comics are a visual medium, and we really should work with the visuals and the dialogue to tell the story, just like a film. But this was a different time period. So anyway, it is. If you're familiar with the Harryhausen films, it is interesting to see the differences. This certainly carries some of the excitement, but it is extremely condensed. So it doesn't quite have the movement that the film has, and the movement of the stop motion characters is really part of a charm of the film. So here we have a fight between the statue. I think in the film, I think they just call her Kali, but I may be misremembering it. In the comic book, it's called something else, which I can't find. It doesn't matter. But if you remember the film, I mean, this was beautifully animated. This was the statue coming to life and fighting with six arms with the swords. It's similar to the skeletons and the Voyage of the Argonauts. So that's supposed to be Tom Baker, Carolyn Monroe, and the green Oompa Loompas. It's also fun, of course, to read these vintage comic columns. Stan Lee and his gang were really promoting their work, and it's a little sad to see that nowadays, with the great success of these Marvel films, Marvel does not advertise its comic books at all. Even with the advantages of Twitter and Facebook, they really have let that slide. But back in 1974, when they just had paper, they were advertising. They advertised in the bottom of pages. They advertised in letters. They were very eager to get their work out there. Now, the Cyclops monster, that fight in the film, that's just marvelous. That's the highlight of the film. I kind of just want to go on YouTube and just watch that. And I'm glad there is a comic version of that, but that fight could have been 20 pages. I mean, that would be like a manga chapter, just that fight and all the different angles and the movement and everything. But once again, different time period. So as to my artwork, over the weekend I did some work in this sketchbook where I'm doing a monochrome comic, red ink on off-white paper. So a couple of pages done. I'm still inking this last page. And this Moleskine notebook is just sort of an idea notebook there. Today I will be penciling and inking a strip, and in the strip I'm playing with the idea of sort of an inside-out rainbow, some type of magical thing, and so I was just kind of sketching some ideas of how that would look in black and white. I don't think people notice, really realize kind of all of the work that goes into artwork, or all of the brainstorming, all of just fiddling with ideas. People seem to think that it just comes out perfectly the first time, and they also think for comics that they were drawn the night before they were published, rather than being part of a process, part of a gardening process. Anyway, so today I'll be working on a kind of a strip that takes some of these ideas, and I will also be painting a couple pages in my tiny sketchbook. So I will talk to you later. Goodbye.